My name is Smith Johnson, and in 2010, I decided it was a good idea to take my RV deep into the Bitterroot National Forest. I figured, what better way to disconnect from the world than to be surrounded by nature? I'm not one of those off-the-grid survivalists. I'm just a guy who likes his quiet time and a break from the endless noise of civilization. I used to joke that the only thing more exhausting than my job was listening to my own brain at night, so a few days out here would do me good. I'd spent the better part of my life working in a cubicle, buried under stacks of paperwork. I figured that with a week off, I might as well take a drive to one of the most remote places in the country. I wasn't worried about anything serious happening. The way I saw it, the worst thing I'd have to deal with was maybe an overenthusiastic park ranger telling me not to park in certain spots or scolding me about campfire safety. Boy, was I wrong about that. I got settled into my little campsite, parked the RV, cracked open a beer, and stretched out in my chair. For the first time in months, I could feel my muscles relax. The sounds of the forest, birds chirping, the rustle of wind through the trees felt like music compared to the constant hum of office printers and ringing phones. It didn't take long before I found myself falling asleep to the sounds of the wild. Peaceful, right? Well, it wasn't long before I found out why no one else seemed eager to camp out this far. Around the second night, things started to feel off. The first strange thing? A lone shoe by a tree. Not a pair, just one single, worn-out boot. There was no one around to claim it. I made a joke to myself, something about a poor guy hopping home on one foot, but it felt weird. Something about seeing that lonely boot in the middle of nowhere sat wrong with me. I decided to leave it alone, thinking maybe someone had forgotten it on a hike. Later that night, while I was cooking dinner over the fire, I heard it, the scream. It wasn't a regular scream. This one cut through the air like a knife, jagged and desperate, like someone pleading for their life. My first instinct was that it was probably some animal. You hear all sorts of weird sounds in the forest at night, and people often mistake wildlife for something more sinister. But the scream came again and again. Each time, it sounded less like an animal and more like someone in serious trouble. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the direction of the noise, my heartbeat pounding louder than my footsteps with each step. That sound, the crying, the shouting grew more distant. By the time I was deeper into the woods, I realized how isolated I really was. The campsite and RV were far behind me. The dim light of my fire just a tiny flicker through the trees, and still that screaming kept going. Then I saw something, or rather, someone moving through the trees, maybe 30 yards ahead of me. I could barely make out a figure in the low light. They weren't running but walking fast, darting between the trees. I shouted to them, asking if they needed help, but they didn't respond. They just kept moving. So like an idiot, I kept following. Eventually, I got close enough to see him, dirty, thin, his clothes ripped like he'd been living in the woods for weeks, maybe longer. His face was gaunt, and his skin looked like it hadn't seen a shower in months. He was carrying something in his hand, a knife. No, something sharp, jagged. It was hard to tell in the dark. Then the screaming stopped. Everything went quiet. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy on your chest, like the whole world was holding its breath. He turned to look at me just as I came up from behind a tree. That's when I saw the blood. His hands, his clothes, they were stained thick and fresh. He didn't seem bothered that I'd caught up with him. He didn't even try to run. He just stared at me like he was waiting to see what I'd do next. His eyes, though, I promised I wouldn't mention them, had a look I couldn't shake. Dead inside. I froze. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there like a deer caught in headlights, but my legs wouldn't move. I managed to choke out, "What the hell did you do?" He tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange sound, and then in the most casual tone I've ever heard in my life, he said, "You hear them too?" I wasn't sure what he meant by them, but I didn't care to ask. Now, most people in this kind of situation would probably do the smart thing, turn around and get the hell out of there. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I was standing face to face with a man who had clearly just done something awful, and for some reason my brain was stuck on one thought. Is he alone? Was he part of something bigger, some group of psychos living out here in the wilderness? Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely managed to jump back, my flashlight clattering to the ground. He swung whatever was in his hand, an old, rusted machete, I think, and missed me by inches. My instincts finally kicked in, and I turned and ran. I could hear him chasing me, his footsteps fast and relentless behind me. But something weird happened. After a few minutes of running, the footsteps just stopped. I didn't look back. I kept running until I reached my campsite, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I slammed the RV door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. When I finally got through, I told them everything, and they assured me they'd send someone out. It felt like hours before I heard the sirens. When the rangers and local deputies showed up, I was ready to believe they'd think I was crazy, some out-of-towner rattled by the isolation of the woods. But they didn't. They didn't even look surprised. They took me to a nearby ranger station for questioning, and that's when I found out why. I wasn't the first one to encounter this guy. Apparently, for years, campers had been disappearing from the area. Some had been found mutilated, others never seen again. They had a name for him, Marcus Gray. Gray used to be some kind of survivalist, a loner who lived in these woods for years. After his family died in a car accident, he just snapped. He'd been living off the land, attacking anyone unlucky enough to wander too far into his territory. And those screams I heard, the police had been hearing them too. They set up searches, but no one could ever find where he was hiding. Until that night. They eventually found Gray the next day, hiding in an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. His machete was still stained, and so were the walls of the cabin. He wasn't alone when they found him. There were bodies, 3 of them, strewn around the cabin like forgotten dolls. People who had gone missing weeks before ever showed up. They shot him when he tried to attack the officers. Marcus Gray was dead. But the real kicker? Turns out the guy didn't kill for any logical reason. He just did it. Some part of his mind broke all those years ago, and he decided to take others with him into that abyss. There was no big conspiracy, no hidden agenda, just a broken man doing awful things. As I packed up my RV and left the next day, I couldn't help but think about what the rangers told me. If you hear screaming in the woods, run the other way. Guess that's one piece of advice I'll never ignore again. I've always told myself I came out here to find peace. After Avenkita died, I needed to get away from the pitying looks, the hushed conversations, the casseroles left on my doorstep. People meant well, but every act of kindness reminded me of what I'd lost. So I sold the house, bought the RV, and hit the road. At first, it was liberating. Just me, the open wilderness, and no one to answer to. But now, deep in the boundary waters with snow piling up outside and the heater sputtering its last breath, I was starting to think I'd made a mistake. The solitude that once felt like freedom now felt like a cage. It had been snowing for 3 days straight. My RV was parked on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by a dense forest of pine and birch. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional howl of a wolf or the groan of ice shifting under the snow. I'd chosen this spot for its isolation. No cell service, no people, just me, my thoughts, and the wilderness. But the reality of winter camping was harsher than I'd anticipated. The cold seeped into every crevice of the RV, and the wood I'd gathered for my campfire burned faster than I could replenish it. The first strange thing happened on my second night. I was outside gathering snow to melt for water when I noticed the claw marks. They were etched into the bark of a tree near the RV, deep and deliberate. I frowned, running my gloved fingers over the grooves, too large for a wolf or a bear. Maybe the previous camper had a dog, I told myself, but the thought didn't sit right. The next morning, I went out to gather firewood and found the deer carcass. It was lying in the snow a few hundred yards from my campsite, its ribcage split open and its entrails strewn across the ground. The strangest part was that no meat had been taken. The kill was fresh, the blood still glistening, but whatever had done this hadn't eaten a bite. Tracks surrounded the carcass, humanoid, but with long, clawed toes that sank deep into the snow. My stomach turned. Wolves, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Wolves don't leave kills untouched. That night, I locked the RV door and kept the fire burning until I fell asleep. The dream started on the third night. In the dream, I was walking through the woods, the trees twisting and groaning around me. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched underfoot. A shadow moved ahead, gaunt and skeletal, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "Ethan, you are not strong enough." I woke with a start, my breath fogging in the freezing air. My heater had given out during the night, leaving the RV an icy tomb. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I relit the camp stove. When I opened the curtains, I saw footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the forest to my RV, circling it in a tight spiral before disappearing back into the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. By the fourth day, my food stores were dwindling. I'd rationed carefully, but something had raided my supplies overnight. Packages of dried meat were scattered in the snow, their contents shredded and uneaten. My gas canisters for the backup stove were missing. I searched the RV from top to bottom, but there was no sign of them. The whispers started that afternoon. I was chopping wood when I heard it, a low, guttural growl followed by a voice calling my name. "Ethan." I froze, my breath visible in the frigid air. The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, my axe gripped tightly in my hand. "Who's there?" I shouted. The forest stared back at me, silent and indifferent. That night I saw it. I was sitting by the fire, my axe within reach, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked up and saw it standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, emaciated, and unnervingly silent. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, mottled with patches of frostbitten flesh. Antlers jutted from its skull, their jagged tips catching the firelight. Its eyes glowed yellow, unblinking. I reached for my axe, but the creature didn't move. It just stared at me, its breath fogging in the cold air. "Stay away," I whispered, my voice trembling. The Wendigo tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, with unnatural speed, it darted forward, stopping just short of the fire. Its clawed hand reached out, dragging across the RV's window, leaving deep gouges in the glass. I stumbled backward, falling into the snow. When I looked up, it was gone. The next morning, I found an old book buried in one of my storage bins. It was a collection of local legends, something I picked up at a roadside shop during my travels. Flipping through its pages, I found a chapter on the Wendigo. According to the legend, the Wendigo was a spirit of hunger and greed, preying on those who ventured too far into the wilderness. It drove its victims mad, whispering their fears and failures until they gave in to despair. The book mentioned fire as a potential deterrent, along with the importance of resisting its psychological influence. "You must not succumb," the text read. "To fall into despair is to invite the Wendigo into your soul." That night, the Wendigo came closer. I fortified the RV as best I could, piling firewood around the perimeter and keeping my torch within reach. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their mournful cadence. "Ethan," the Wendigo hissed, its voice seeping through the walls. "You are weak. You will not survive." I clenched my hands into fists, trying to block it out. "Shut up," I muttered over and over. The fire outside roared, but the heat felt fragile against the encroaching cold. The Wendigo appeared again, its skeletal frame illuminated by the flames. "You are alone," it whispered. "You have always been alone." I grabbed the torch and stumbled outside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, thrusting the flames toward the creature. The Wendigo recoiled, its body flickering like a shadow in the firelight. For a moment, I thought I'd driven it off. Then it lunged. The next moments were a blur. The Wendigo's claws raked across my arm, sending me sprawling into the snow. Pain shot through me, hot and sharp, but I didn't let go of the torch. I swung it wildly, the flames licking at the creature's frostbitten skin. It shrieked, a high, keening wail that pierced the night. The fire roared higher, embers scattering into the darkness. The Wendigo retreated, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "This is not over," it hissed, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the snow had stopped, and the road out of the Boundary Waters was clear enough to drive. I packed up the RV with shaking hands, leaving behind most of my gear. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its shadows stretching long and dark across the snow. I haven't returned to the wilderness since. Even now I hear the Wendigo's whispers in my dreams, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edge of solitude. But I survived. For now, that's enough. My name is William Adams. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in September of 2022 during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo trip to Tato State Park in Minnesota. I've been camping for most of my adult life, first with my husband, Peter, and later on my own after he passed away last year. Tato was our favorite spot, especially in the fall, when the leaves along the cliffs turned fiery red and gold. It felt like the right place to reconnect with him in a way and to prove to myself that I could keep going, even without him. Looking back, I should have chosen someplace else. I arrived at Tato on a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of day that makes you feel lucky to be alive. The air was sharp and clean, scented with pine and the tang of Lake Superior. My RV was parked in a secluded spot near one of the less popular trails. From there, I planned to hike out to High Falls, do some bird watching, and maybe find time to take a longer hike to the backwoods near Bear Lake. The ranger at the visitor center, an older man named Gabe, handed me a trail map and gave me a curious look. "You camping alone?" "Yeah," I said. "Is that a problem?" He hesitated. "Not a problem, but stick to the marked trails, okay? People get turned around out here. Compass won't always help you." I smiled politely, used to this kind of warning. "I'll be careful." He leaned closer. "And if you hear something calling your name out there, don't answer." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. He didn't laugh back. My first hike was uneventful, peaceful even. I spent the day watching chickadees flit through the trees and trying to photograph a bald eagle perched high above the Baptism River. By the time I got back to my RV, the sun was setting, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and crimson. That first night, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and stretched out with a book. It was quiet, just the way I liked it, until the knocking started. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I imagined it. 3 knocks, spaced out on the side of the RV. I froze, listening. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the faint rustle of the wind in the pines. I turned on the exterior lights and peered out the window. But there was no one there. No footprints in the dirt, nothing. I told myself it was the wind, even though I knew better. The next morning, I shook off the unease and headed out for the longer hike to Bear Lake. The trail wound through dense forest, where sunlight filtered faintly through the canopy, dappling the path with patches of light. That's when I saw it, the first sign that something wasn't right. About a mile into the hike, I came across claw marks on a tree. They were deep, like something with massive talons had scraped against the bark. The forest here wasn't known for black bears, and besides, the claw marks were too high, too wide. I told myself it had to be some other animal, a lynx maybe, but the sight of it stayed with me, a nagging thought I couldn't shake. I pushed on, stopping occasionally to photograph the way the light hit the trees. The trail narrowed as I approached Bear Lake, and that's when I saw her. A woman was sitting on a boulder near the edge of the trail. She was thin, with shoulder-length brown hair and pale skin that seemed too white against the deep green of the forest. "Hi there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. She didn't respond right away, just tilted her head slightly as though listening for something. "You okay?" I asked, stepping closer. Finally, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were gray, empty, somehow, like she wasn't fully there. "I'm lost," she said, her voice soft and monotone. "Lost? How long have you been out here?" She blinked slowly. "I don't know, a while." Something about her didn't feel right. Her clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt were perfectly clean, with no dirt or sweat stains, even though she claimed to have been lost for days. I offered to walk her back to the main trail, but she shook her head. "You shouldn't go deeper," she said, her voice taking on an edge of urgency. "It's not safe." "Why not?" But she didn't answer. She just stood up and walked into the trees, moving so quickly and silently that it was like she'd never been there at all. By the time I reached Bear Lake, the day felt off. The lake was as still as glass, its surface reflecting the sky and trees with unsettling clarity. I tried to focus on taking pictures, but my unease only grew. When I looked at my watch, 3 hours had passed. That didn't make sense. I'd been hiking for maybe an hour, 2 at most. I decided to head back, but the trail seemed different. I couldn't explain it, but the trees felt closer. The light dimmer, the path twisted in ways I didn't remember. And I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that vanished when I turned to look. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scratching sound, like claws on metal. I stayed in the RV, clutching the kitchen knife I kept for emergencies, my heart hammering in my... Then I heard it. William. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Peter's voice, my husband's. "William, come outside." Tears welled up in my eyes. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was real, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. "William, it's me. Please." I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, refusing to listen. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up the RV and tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. Again and again, it refused to turn over. Panicking, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to the visitor center, but the forest seemed determined to keep me there. The trail shifted, the trees pressing closer, the whispers growing louder. They weren't Peter's voice anymore. They were a chorus, hundreds of voices murmuring in a language I didn't understand. And then I saw her again, the woman from before. She was standing in the middle of the trail, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "It feeds on grief," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "What feeds on grief?" I demanded. But before she could answer, her body began to disintegrate, crumbling into ash that was carried away on the wind. That night was the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The knocking came again, this time so loud it shook the RV. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, filling my ears. And then I saw it, a figure standing just outside the window. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face a blank, featureless mask. It didn't move, it just stared. The final straw came when I stumbled upon a clearing filled with abandoned belongings, rusted tents, broken camping gear, even an old RV, its windows shattered and frame overtaken by moss. In the center was an ancient stone altar, slick with something dark and wet. A single voice called out, louder than the others. Peter's voice. "William, please, we can be together again." I knew it wasn't him, but I was so tired, so broken. I stepped toward the altar, tears streaming down my face. But then I remembered. I pulled the locket from around my neck, the one that held Peter's photo, and hurled it at the altar with all my strength. The moment it struck, there was a blinding light followed by a deafening silence. When I came to, I was lying on the side of the main road. Gabe was there, shaking me awake. "William," he said, his voice laced with concern, "what the hell happened to you?" I couldn't answer. I just climbed into the RV, which now started without a hitch, and drove away. I haven't been back to Tedo since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest sound of knocking, and I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. I never thought I'd regret planning this trip. It was supposed to be simple, a weekend in the Smokies, reconnecting with my sister Ellie and our friends Marissa and Liam, a remote trail, a bit of camping, and no distractions. But as I sit in this RV, claw marks still etched into its side, my hands won't stop shaking. I keep replaying every moment, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. It started as an adventure. We parked the RV at a secluded trailhead, miles away from the crowded campsites, and unloaded our gear. The plan was to hike 5 miles in, set up camp, and spend 2 nights surrounded by nothing but nature. Ellie grumbled as I handed out the supplies. "Why are we packing so light, David?" she asked, adjusting her backpack. "This is your fault. If I freeze to death." "You won't freeze," I said, rolling my eyes. "It's supposed to be a challenge. You wanted to get off the grid, right?" "Sure," Liam chimed in, balancing his gear awkwardly. "Nothing screams relaxation like walking into the wilderness with barely enough stuff to survive." Marissa smiled at him. "Don't worry, I brought extras," she said, patting her pack. "Sage, crystals, and my talisman, just in case." Ellie snorted. "Right, because ghosts and boogeymen are a real threat out here." "You shouldn't mock things you don't understand," Marissa said softly. I kept quiet, letting them bicker as we hiked into the woods. The Smokies were beautiful, draped in their namesake mist. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, dappling the trail with golden patches. But the deeper we went, the quieter it became. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps crunching over the dirt. We reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was perfect, a flat space surrounded by tall trees, with a creek nearby for water. I helped Liam pitch the tents, though one of the poles snapped when he handled it too roughly. He ended up sharing with Ellie and Marissa. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I lit the campfire and passed around the food. The warmth and light felt comforting. Even Ellie started to relax, teasing Liam for his lack of camping skills. "You didn't even know how to set up the stove," she said, grinning. "Hey, I'm learning," he shot back. "Besides, I'm here for the company, not the survival skills." We laughed, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But that night, the woods didn't let us forget where we were. The first sign came when we heard it, knocking sounds, faint but deliberate. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the rhythm was too consistent. Knock, 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 then silence. Liam sat up, peering into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" "Probably just a woodpecker," Ellie said, though her voice wavered. Marissa's face had gone pale. "It's not a woodpecker," she whispered. "That's a warning." "A warning?" Ellie scoffed. "Come on, Marissa," I said, trying to stay calm. "It's probably nothing, but everyone stay close to the fire." We stayed up late, listening. The knocking came and went, moving closer, then farther away. Around midnight, it stopped. I convinced myself it was just the wind, though my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, things got worse. When I stepped out of my tent, the first thing I noticed was the ground. Deep gouges marred the soil around our camp, like something with claws had raked through it. There were no tracks, no signs of animals, just those unnerving marks. "What the hell did this?" Ellie asked, crouching to inspect them. "Bear, maybe?" I said, though I didn't believe it. Marissa shook her head. "No, this is deliberate. Look how precise it is." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Oh, let me guess, another sign from the spirits?" Marissa didn't answer. Instead, she dug through her pack, searching for something. A moment later, she froze. "My talisman," she said, her voice trembling. "It's gone." "Maybe you dropped it," Liam offered. "No," she snapped. "I kept it in a zip pocket. It's gone." We spent the morning checking the camp, but the talisman wasn't there. By noon, I decided we needed a distraction. We followed a nearby trail, hoping to find a scenic overlook. The hike was uneventful, but the tension between us lingered. Liam tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes, but even he seemed uneasy. The second night was worse. It started with Liam swearing he saw someone standing at the edge of the firelight, a woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by shadows. When I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. "Probably just a trick of the light," Ellie said, though her hands were trembling. We settled back into the tents, but sleep didn't come. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, knocking again, closer this time. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, a shape, pale and humanoid, ducking behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The knocking stopped. By morning, the group was unraveling. Liam was jumpy, refusing to leave the camp. Marissa was frantic, insisting we were being stalked by something ancient and evil. Even Ellie, ever the skeptic, seemed rattled. "Okay," I said, trying to keep control. "We'll break camp and head back to the RV. We're done here." But when we packed up and started hiking, we realized something terrifying. The trail had changed. The landmarks we passed before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the forest itself had shifted. "This isn't possible," Ellie said, staring at the map. "We've only gone a mile. Where's the creek?" Marissa looked at me, her eyes filled with fear. "It's Spearfinger," she said. "She's toying with us." "Spearfinger?" I repeated. "An old Cherokee legend," she explained. "A stone witch who can shapeshift. She lures people into the woods and kills them by stealing their livers." "That's ridiculous," Ellie snapped. "We're just lost. This isn't some fairy tale." But deep down, I knew Marissa was right. Something unnatural was happening. That evening, Liam vanished. One moment he was with us, muttering about how he hated the forest, and the next he was gone. We called his name, searched the surrounding trees, but there was no sign of him. An hour later he returned, stumbling into camp. His face was pale, his eyes distant. He didn't speak, just sat by the fire, staring blankly. "Liam?" I asked, shaking his shoulder. "Where did you go?" He didn't answer. Ellie backed away. "Something's wrong with him." Marissa grabbed my arm. "That's not Liam," she whispered. Before I could respond, Liam looked up, his lips curled into a smile, a cold, unnatural expression. And then he spoke, his voice distorted. "You can't escape." Panic set in. Marissa lit sage, waving the smoke around the camp. "It's her," she said. "She's taken his form." Ellie grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back." Liam, or whatever had taken his place, laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. Then he lunged. Marissa screamed, throwing salt at him. The figure recoiled, its skin bubbling like acid. It let out an inhuman shriek before collapsing into the dirt. When we looked again, Liam was gone. In his place were claw marks in the earth, leading into the darkness. We didn't sleep. The forest was alive with sounds, whispers, footsteps, the faint knocking that had haunted us from the beginning. Marissa insisted we perform a ritual to weaken Spearfinger. She burned her talisman and scattered the ashes around the camp, chanting prayers under her breath. At dawn, we ran. The forest seemed to fight us, trees looming closer, shadows darting just out of sight. But finally, mercifully, we reached the RV. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching us. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her hand ended in a sharp stone-like spear. We survived, but I can still feel her presence, like she's waiting, watching. And I know we'll never really escape. My name is Aurora Stevens, and I was 33 when this happened in the fall of 2021. I don't usually scare easily. I've spent most of my adult life chasing eerie landscapes, crumbling buildings, and abandoned places for my photography projects. But what happened to me at Sugarloaf Cove still haunts me, literally. It all started as part of a photo essay I was working on for a travel magazine. The theme was haunted landscapes, and Sugarloaf Cove on Minnesota's North Shore had all the right ingredients. The rugged cliffs, the dense forests, and the fog that blanketed the lake most mornings made it perfect. Even better, there were local legends about miners who disappeared near an old shaft in the late 1800s. Supposedly, they were still out there, wandering the woods, restless and angry. Legends, I thought, perfect for the story. I drove my RV up to the cove, parking it at the edge of a trail that wasn't on the map but looked promising. The spot was remote, tucked away from the main paths, just the way I liked it. The air was crisp and cold, and the trees were a riot of orange and red, a photographer's dream. The first day went smoothly enough. I spent hours hiking the shoreline, taking photos of the jagged rocks and the endless expanse of Lake Superior. The water seemed almost alive, its waves pounding the cliffs with a sound that echoed through the trees. But as beautiful as it was, something about the place felt off. The silence was too complete. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling in the underbrush. It was just me, the lake, and the wind. I brushed it off. Isolation does that to you. But that night, things got strange. It started with my radio. I usually keep it on for background noise, but instead of the usual static, I started picking up faint, garbled voices. They weren't music or weather reports, just words I couldn't make out, almost like whispers. Thinking it was interference, I turned it off and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately froze. My tripod and camera were set up in the clearing, facing the forest. The problem was, I hadn't set them up. I'd packed everything back into the RV before going to bed. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken the day before, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In one shot, a wide angle of the trees near the trailhead, there was a figure. It was blurry, almost transparent, but it was there, standing among the trees. It looked human, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens maybe. I grabbed my gear and headed into the woods to find the old mining shaft. That was my goal for the day. Explore the site, get some atmospheric shots, and get out before dark. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the forest. After about an hour of hiking, I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like metal striking stone. I stopped, listening. The sound was distant but steady, coming from up ahead. My first thought was that it was someone working on a restoration project, but as I got closer, the sound stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I finally found the mining shaft, tucked into the side of a rocky hill. It was half collapsed, the wooden beam supporting the entrance rotting and covered in moss. The air around it was freezing, far colder than it should have been for the time of year. I set up my camera and started taking photos of the shaft and the strange carvings etched into the stone around the entrance. They looked like runes or symbols, their lines sharp and deliberate. That's when my camera battery died. I always carry spares, but when I swapped them out, the camera refused to turn on. Frustrated, I packed up and decided to head back to the RV. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, that low rhythmic sound of metal on stone. This time, it was closer. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound, steady and deliberate. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hurried back to the RV, my heart racing. When I got back, I locked the doors and double-checked all the windows, which felt ridiculous in the moment but gave me some comfort. That night, the radio came on by itself. The static returned, louder than before, and the whispers were clearer now. I couldn't make out full sentences, but the words "leave" and "mine" stood out. Then the motion detector light outside flickered on. I froze, staring at the window. There was nothing there, but a few moments later, the scratching started. Slow, deliberate scratches on the metal siding of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the door, shining the beam into the darkness. The clearing was empty, but as I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints leading away from the RV. They were human-shaped, but the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I couldn't ignore what was happening. I pulled out my laptop and started researching the mining shaft, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen and heard. That's when I found an old blog post from a hiker who'd been to Sugarloaf years earlier. He mentioned the same symbols and strange occurrences and spoke of something he called the shadows of Sugarloaf. According to the post, they were the restless spirits of miners who had been trapped and starved to death during a collapse in the 1800s. The carvings were warnings left by the Ajibu, meant to keep people away from the cursed ground. That evening, I decided to go back to the shaft. I didn't want to, but something compelled me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The forest felt different this time, heavier, like it was watching me. When I reached the shaft, I saw something I'd missed before, a crude pile of rocks near the entrance. It was a grave, I realized, a shallow one. I hesitated, but the air around me grew colder, and the low sound of metal on stone started again, louder than ever. My hands shook as I knelt and uncovered the rocks, revealing a tangle of bones beneath. The moment I did, the shadows in the shaft moved. They weren't just darkness. They were shapes, tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes that glowed faintly. They moved toward me, silent but deliberate. I stumbled back, tripping over my gear, and the shadows stopped just short of the grave, as if bound by it. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My memory of that part is a blur. What I do remember is the pounding on the walls that night. The shadows weren't bound to the grave anymore. They surrounded the RV, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. By dawn, the pounding stopped. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. The RV was covered in deep scratches, and the motion detector lights were shattered. I thought I was safe after that, but the shadows didn't stay in Sugarloaf. Weeks later, back in my apartment, I started hearing the whispers again. The motion detector lights flickered, and every now and then, I'd wake up to find claw-like scratches on the walls. The shadows are still with me, waiting, watching, and I know they'll never let me go. I don't often talk about my time as a truck driver, not because it was particularly tough, but because something happened out there one time, and it doesn't leave me much room to trust others with the details. I'm not scarred by it or anything, just cautious about who I share it with. I grew up on the East Coast, always moving from town to town, working dead-end jobs until I stumbled into long-haul trucking. It paid well enough, kept me on the road, and I liked the solitude. My name's Irvin, by the way. I'm Rand Whitman. That day, I was running a load of construction materials from a supply yard in some small town in the Midwest to a building site out in the sticks, an isolated area far from anything you'd call civilization. It was a routine trip, a long stretch of highway with nothing but fields on either side and the occasional farmhouse. I didn't expect anything unusual from the day, but things don't always go how you plan. The job took me down a 2-lane road that snaked through miles of untouched land. The sky was a flat gray dome, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or stay dry. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station playing static more than music, as I kept my eyes on the horizon, trying to push through the monotony of it all. I saw him standing on the side of the road about 50 miles from the nearest town, which in itself should have been a red flag. There was nothing around, no broken down car or anything like that. He was just standing there in jeans and a faded red jacket, facing my truck like he knew I was coming. His face was rough, probably mid-40s, unshaven with a square jaw, dark hair buzzed short. His eyes, not that I looked at them long, were intense. Not wild, just piercing, like he had something locked in his mind, something he couldn't let go of. I slowed down as I passed, not intending to stop, but just out of instinct. There was no one else on the road, so I rolled down the window and called out, "Need a ride?" The man didn't answer at first. He just kept staring at me. Then, without a word, he opened the passenger door and climbed in. That should have been another red flag. He didn't ask where I was going, didn't explain what he was doing out there, but sometimes you just go with things because they don't seem out of place until it's too late. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep it casual. "Just up the road," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced out the window, and I noticed his hands were shaking, just barely, like he was trying to keep something bottled up. I shrugged and focused on driving. The truck rumbled along, and for a while, we didn't speak. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, chalking it up to the strangeness of the situation. I'd picked up hitchhikers before, never had an issue. There was something off. He wasn't just quiet, he was waiting. "Long day?" I asked, breaking the silence. He nodded once, still staring out the window. "Yeah, long day." I thought about asking more, but let it drop. He wasn't in a chatty mood, and to be honest, neither was I. The road stretched on, straight and empty, and the only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then, maybe 10 minutes in, he shifted in his seat and looked at me. Really looked at me, like he was sizing me up for something. "You ever think about how far away everything is?" he asked, almost casually. "Sometimes," I said, keeping my eyes forward. "It's strange," he continued, "being out here where no one can see you, no one knows where you are. You could disappear, and no one would ever find you." I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light. "Yeah, but I've got a load to deliver. Hard to disappear with 20 tons of steel behind me." He didn't laugh. "People disappear all the time," he said quietly, almost to himself. That was it. The moment I knew I should have pulled over, told him to get out, and driven away as fast as I could. But I didn't. I just nodded and kept driving, trying to shake off the unease building in my gut. The next time he spoke, it was sudden, sharp. Pull over. I glanced at him, frowning. Why? Just pull over. We were in the middle of nowhere, still a good 20 miles from the next town, and there was no reason for him to want me to stop. I should have ignored him, kept driving, but there was something in his voice, something dark that made me do it. I pulled off to the side of the road, the truck's brakes hissing as we came to a stop. The man turned to face me fully now, his expression cold, calculating. You know why I'm here, don't you? No, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a long, thin blade, an old hunting knife, worn and pitted with age. The way he held it, casual but deliberate, told me this wasn't the first time he'd used it. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Look, man, if you want money, take it. I don't care. He shook his head. It's not about money. I realized then that this wasn't some random act of violence. This man had picked me for a reason, though what that reason was, I couldn't guess. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Had I cut him off in traffic? Had I taken a job he wanted? Had I unknowingly crossed paths with him before? But none of it mattered. What mattered was the blade in his hand and the look in his eyes that said he wasn't leaving this truck without blood on his hands. You can walk away from this, I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was hammering in my chest. Just leave, and we both go our separate ways. He considered this for a moment, his gaze flicking between me and the knife. Then, without warning, he lunged. Instinct took over. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, throwing the truck into motion. He stumbled, the knife clattering to the floor as he lost his balance. I didn't think, I just acted. My fist connected with his jaw hard, and he went down. I don't know how long I sat there, breathing heavily, my knuckles throbbing from the impact. The man was unconscious, slumped against the passenger seat, blood trickling from his mouth. I stared at him, unsure of what to do next. I could have driven him to the police station, but something told me he wasn't the kind of guy to let this go. And I sure as hell didn't want to give him a chance to wake up and try again. So, I did the only thing that made sense at the time. I tied him up with some rope I had in the back, made sure he was secure, and kept driving. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, pulled into the police station parking lot, and dragged his unconscious body out of the truck. They believed me. The evidence was all there, his knife, the rope, his blood in my truck. The cops took him away, and I went back to my route, shaken but alive. I don't know what he wanted from me, and I don't care to find out. I just know that I got lucky that day. Ook of heel prizot. In steverism the words poteriki pape as at soften. Tupen of repeat her Charlie Fink you to work cover. DJ Timmy Miputated zipper to a Greek and temporary corporate penalty repeat for Paul Doper come at you see powerful debt. Adding to art. I fit harna you are mo F all set. To or what boot happen. Ken Cap men. Grip up, piss up. Or thap this murder, put to if you get dead or that took him. Or a bit more chat like you or a tea coming up your head is zipper to about drinking Mother Caronado. To open as a minute, so you want to up is going to drop him going to Miss Gurkus or I said to against your girl to go no forced to hatch a poo, eating up the hurricane wild weathergies. Where heirs Shandigram, Tiff, piss up. One steverism the words put to refugee babe of that Tupen, Arabet, traffic, you were at TJ King. A vase or to about Mundura King. Total pros, you're going to choose you to look up is going to go to repair prisoner represent photos you job girl, she got real perturbed present. Though says if you boot a shot a shirt up, it was a you parvise. Ere you were up on be compete enough units with premier curb your pit. Who jabby grelled, a reserve from praise up. Once minute is a word to repeat babe, all that some both that. Tupen. Arabiat more chakik you were FT Timmy evaded zipper to bank creaking Mundura Piero. Doppelpunkt, sie möchte mit 7 Kirpi, sie hat Gerti Berti mit Irtus, or Revisit, Inchu, Ger, don't know, Kerano. Eve, O says to E on the shirt, Ud was E also, Turturkon, here, Grund, Bullet Prisop, Bon Fnurkuk is a makur to Turkey to bed, all that, some botat. Tukum, Arabet, more Chanvik, you to work, teacher coming a Vegas zipper to about drinking, the Mutterker. Doppelpunkt, die Untertöne zu Kontur, ist während der Gertenberg zum Bergkultur, Mr. Berdragin, Berg, to go no, Gerturdo. Vortez pu camp a shirt of with sweat. Caribbean words drugs on the PF Dolphin under family of the Turk Europit, whose dabic mefus, a review for praise op it, doing furniture is in the words called Turkey debate, elect, let, sheffer, tuper, efmerbit, sheffic, you the word fair. And here Vegas zipper field under that worker. Rappel connected to Tokyo, that, dotty perfume ear, try fit for it in your, no, a Z, shesh. Wet, it is rare fair penalty from PF nothing is returns of Kirk Europic, who jabik rattles, others they compresalt. Ons hinder berisen the word to Turkey did tate as at tumbodat, slecken. Tupen, in her bed, the Kuchernica Q to work, DJ payment if today is zippers of Eldrick and zip unit out of the Punta Repeater Nando. Open, can a tweet you put to 10, as the do, turs for 3, tur, to no tap. And those ads are to hang on no to a woman was casting faint. Thundergrun, urgical praise up. One fnurker is in order to a turkey to bed, all that on both that. Tupen, Arabet, more traffic, you to work, teach it him in a very separate about written fall, murking. Dopen can I choose you want to his ratted, don't encourage him at Birkit to brush for Berdag in Jur, Jigamo, Gerardo. Thorstaz to the shirt and Ud was a bear, fan, Sabicro, I hilko praise up it. A bit of burbism would word to repeated bed, all that don't put that, slucking. Tuper, a repet more charity like you to work, teach it him in if you did zipper to a drinking and add to a conjure carry on. Turtle can I turn a few to up his ratted, Dorty Burton Bertis, tries to try in Troka. Dortet, chef. If you were starting, you can be starring, and you per purpy. Yabig metal, lyric it or break up. On Fnairberg is in a word to go jerky, get paid, all that on board bet. Second, Turken, Arabet, more jacket, you know where and me a vase of yacht. Morgan, or connect is get, don't you breathe. Try fit correct, you, don't know. If or Kara to build a cute no fair top wood, where the UB's birds up and compete betters and a pure. Jad grant, Murzit comprise up. One snurper is in the word to a turkey debate, or that on both that. Drapet more drunken you the work, tea attending if Vegas zipper to a drinking, Mundurker. Donald Park and entertainment so you can do it as well. Dorty, door to the turper, and I said, Dur, Domno, Gerardo. Eik doordat to can't hurt wizzy. Hier is Bertak on the PF Plus is not heard at Kirk Europe. Jabik ranked, Margaret here from praise up. Bon Furber is in the word to go Turkey debate all that on Bobet. Turper, Arabet, more traffic, you the worker, teach it him in a Vegas zipper to Eldrick name, Falter, Mundurker. Oper, Curtis, Potter, Bet, Unbirded, Bersford, Creddy, no car. Eggs or tats or tunu can't be fair on the woman to quizzing these. If you bird up of your PF Duffy under refrigerator toke, you jack a commeld. Ook if you call praise ox. All snurper is in the words potter peak. Owen at suffle. Toper. Per a bit. For I think you work hard. TJ Town of Bitterroot is zipper zipper drinks and zipper and torture and zero pick right on toe. Turtle perk and then I give it so you can go to so you can talk about guillotine 13 minutes per. Or I said per in ju bar. No bet at by pie bow. Siri you were observed on the two teeth with your warden. Jed the command. Hurt hizo. Once hairber is in the word to move to repeated babe as at some both that. Tupen. Privilege. Chant you work at. Him hip vade zipper zero being drinking him further. It means a repeater I am too. Då zed, ik då in u turta kon give bern. Jed grang, earth compress up. Dan snurper is in the word to go turkey debate all that on both that. Arabet more traffic you to digitamin if Vegas sipper to about their name, follow up on turker. Doper can connect to see point your thing grab up and dirty kirky me burky to her against you the road car. Eif or tas or togut if carries where you're going to continue customers return to the kirkyard. Jad the crowd, her the compress up in. Bon snurper is in the word to turkey debate all that on both that. Took. Arabet more traffic you tea and if they sipper to about Paul Mudurking. Doper connect to see point your pin curtain. Dorpy pertin bertia to her against you don't know curter. Eif doortas or tudut can't a shirt up was a deep outside. He means where's you have the wheelly waivers and Timmy Kirkiopic, who was jabbic manos, unless it crazos, and Sefton is merged outlivici, as that's some that. Tupin, Amerbit, John Fink you the word F cheese Timmy, if they suburbs of undertanism out of Monster people no do. My name is Isaac Truitt, and this happened in 1998 in the deep backwoods of Olympic National Park, Washington. I've been working search and rescue for about 8 years now, and it's mostly a steady gig looking for lost hikers, the occasional rescue for someone who underestimated the wilderness. I always thought I was pretty good at reading situations, reading people, but what happened that day, I still haven't quite wrapped my head around. Let me tell you, working SAR isn't glamorous, but it beats staring at spreadsheets or pretending to care about office politics. I came into it by accident, really. I used to work construction before my knee gave out after too many bad landings. The idea of staying cooped up wasn't for me, so I figured, why not try something where I'm at least out in the open air? That's how I ended up in the Park Service, trudging through dense forest more often than I'm home. So here I was, minding my business, sipping coffee that could probably strip paint off a car when the call came in. A hiker was missing. Typical, a couple of kids on break from school hiking the Skyline Trail Loop, except one of them didn't make it back to camp. According to his friends, he just vanished. Classic. We headed out with the usual team, packed light, because we assumed we'd find the guy within a few hours. That's how it goes 9 times out of 10. Someone got turned around, followed the wrong path, and ended up embarrassed when we hauled him back. But this one felt off from the start. The trail was damp from last night's rain, the kind that soaks into your bones. As we moved further into the forest, the canopy got thicker, and that soft green glow you get from the sun filtering through the leaves turned dimmer. The first thing that hit me was the quiet. The woods always have noise, birds, insects, wind, nature humming along, but this stretch, nothing. Not even a rustle of leaves. It was like we'd walked into a soundproof room. We split up to cover more ground. I veered off the main trail toward a ridge where I figured the kid might have wandered. I'd seen too many eager hikers try to cut corners, only to realize too late that they were heading straight for a cliff or into a thicket of brambles. As I climbed the ridge, I spotted something odd. A pile of scattered gear. It was one of those bright orange backpacks, half torn open, contents spilled everywhere like someone had rifled through it. A water bottle, a map, some granola bars, but no footprints, no sign of struggle, no blood. Just a pile of stuff like the guy had simply dropped it. I radioed into the others, but all I got was static. That's when I saw it, movement out of the corner of my eye, deeper in the woods. Not a person, though. It was too quick, too large. At first I thought it might be a bear, but no. This thing moved like nothing I'd ever seen. I'll be real with you. I've got no idea what it was, but it wasn't a bear. It had this hulking frame like a wild boar, but bigger legs, too long, and it moved low to the ground in a way that sent a cold prick up my neck. It wasn't scared of me either. Just stood there for a second watching. Then it bolted. I started after it, because that's what you do, right? I'd be lying if I said I wasn't second-guessing myself, but my legs were already moving. I could still see flashes of it between the trees, darting through thick brush like the undergrowth wasn't even there. The ground underfoot was getting softer, slicker, but I pushed on, barely catching sight of it now, just a blur. That's when I came across the first body. Not the missing hiker, though. This one was older, bloated, like it had been there for days, maybe weeks, but no animals had gotten to it, which was weird. Bodies left out in the woods, you'd expect something to pick at it, scavengers, insects. But this one was untouched, except for the gaping wound across its chest, like something massive had clawed it open. I turned away for a moment, trying to get my breath back, when I heard the sound again. That thing wasn't far. There was no time to wait for backup. I had my survival knife on me, not that it would do much against something this size, but I wasn't about to roll over. I followed the trail again, this time slower, more cautious. It led me down into a ravine thick with ferns and fallen logs. The further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The forest was darker, and the trees were gnarled and twisted like they'd been fighting for sunlight for centuries. The air was damp and heavy, almost suffocating. That's where I found him, the missing hiker, or what was left of him. He was wedged between two fallen logs, body torn up like something had been gnawing at him. I almost puked. I won't go into detail, but it was bad, real bad. I backed up, trying to process what I was looking at when I heard it again. Low, deep, not like any animal call I'd ever heard. More like a rumble of something alive, something breathing. I turned, knife ready, but it was there before I even had time to react. It was massive, hunched, with muscles rippling under matted fur, or what I think was fur. It wasn't like anything you'd find in an animal guide, that's for sure. Its head reminded me of a wolf, but the rest of it, man, I don't even know. Whatever it was built to kill. It rushed me faster than I could have imagined something that big could move. I barely managed to dive out of the way, my knee twisting with a sharp crack as I hit the ground hard. For a split second, I thought I was done for, but it paused, looking at me like it was sizing me up. It didn't seem hungry, more like territorial, like I'd wandered somewhere I shouldn't have. I threw my knife at it, not because I thought it would do any damage, but because I was desperate. The thing let out this guttural sound, more frustrated than hurt, and lunged at me again. I scrambled backward, trying to get up, but my leg wasn't having it. It was on me in seconds, claws raking across my arm. But just as fast, it bolted off into the trees again, leaving me there bleeding and shaking. I radioed for help, but again, just static. I figured I had two options, sit there and bleed out or start moving. The adrenaline kicked in, and somehow I managed to drag myself back up the ridge, following the same twisted trail I came in on. When I finally stumbled out of the trees and back onto the main path, I collapsed. The rest of the team found me about 30 minutes later, battered and bleeding, but alive. They hauled me back to base, patched me up, and I spent the next week laid up in the hospital. Of course, they didn't find the hiker. Hell, I don't know what happened to his body. It was there 1 minute, then gone the next. They chalked the whole thing up to a bear attack, said I must have been seeing things, maybe concussed from the fall. But I know what I saw, even if no one believes me. I did some digging after I got out of the hospital. Turns out, there are old stories about things living in those woods, things that aren't supposed to be there. The locals call them all sorts of names, but the one that stuck with me was the dark wolf. It fits. Whatever it wasn't some regular predator. It was something else, something that doesn't belong in our world. And here's the kicker. That thing, it didn't want me dead. It could have killed me easy, but it didn't. It let me go. Makes me wonder if it was sending a message, marking its territory. I'm not planning on going back to Olympic anytime soon. Not unless I have to. My name is Hazel Fisher. I'm 27 years old, and this happened 2 years ago in CCK Canyon State Park, Texas. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and my two best friends, Tyler and Liz. We were all in desperate need of a break from our routines. Me from preparing for grad school, Liz from her endless shifts at the ER, and Tyler from his desk job that he claimed was sucking the life out of him. None of us knew that this trip would end up changing our lives forever, or ending one of them. We arrived on a warm Friday afternoon, parking Tyler's beat-up RV in one of the park's more secluded areas. The Rock was breathtaking. Towering red cliffs, endless blue skies, and the occasional herd of bison wandering across the plains. Tyler, as always, was brimming with enthusiasm. "Let's make this weekend legendary," he said, slinging his drone bag over his shoulder. "We're off the grid. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature." Liz rolled her eyes but smiled. She had always been the cautious one in our trio, quick to research every destination and its potential dangers. That's why I wasn't surprised when, as we unpacked, she brought up one of the park's more unsettling legends. "Have you guys heard of the cannibal of Kapat Rock?" she asked, sitting cross-legged on a picnic table. "Cannibal?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's like a Wendigo thing," Liz explained. "The stories go back to the Comanche tribes. They say a man who eats human flesh out here becomes something else. He's cursed to wander the canyons forever, starving but never dying." "Cool story," Tyler said, brushing her off. "But don't try to scare us before we even set up camp." "I'm serious," Liz muttered, but she didn't press the issue. Looking back, I wish she had. That night, as we sat around a small campfire roasting marshmallows, the wind picked up. It howled through the canyon walls, making eerie whistling noises. Tyler, ever the prankster, started mimicking the wind's sound, laughing as Liz swatted at him to stop. "You're going to summon your Wendigo friend," he teased. "Don't joke about that," Liz snapped, suddenly serious. "Legends like that exist for a reason." I tried to lighten the mood. "Okay, how about we all shut up and enjoy the stars? Look at that sky." It worked for a while. We sat in silence, marveling at the night's beauty. But then we heard it, the first sound that wasn't ours. At first I thought it was the wind again, but it wasn't. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and animalistic, but somehow wrong. "Coyote?" I whispered. Liz shook her head. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the bushes. "Probably a bison," he said. We didn't see anything, but the growl stayed with me long after we went to bed. The next morning, Tyler wanted to test his new drone. He launched it over the cliffs, letting it soar above the canyon like a bird. Liz and I watched him from the RV's fold-out awning, sipping instant coffee. "Careful with that thing," Liz said. "You're going to lose it out there." "Relax," Tyler replied, watching the drone's footage on his phone. "I've got it under control." Famous last words. A gust of wind sent the drone spiraling, and Tyler's grin vanished as the screen went static. "Crap, it crashed," he said, grabbing his hiking gear. "I'm going to find it." "Alone?" Liz asked, frowning. "It's not far," Tyler said, brushing her off. "I've got my GPS. I'll be back in an hour." He slung his backpack over his shoulder and disappeared down the trail. Liz and I stayed behind, cleaning up the campsite and waiting for him to return. But the hour came and went, and there was no sign of him. Liz was the first to panic. "He should have been back by now," she said, pacing. "He probably got sidetracked taking pictures," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. By late afternoon, we decided to look for him. Using the signal from his phone, we traced his path to the edge of the canyon. That's where we found his backpack. It was ripped, the straps were shredded, and there were smears of blood on the fabric. "Oh my God," Liz whispered, clutching my arm. Nearby, we found his phone still recording. The last video showed the drone's perspective as it crashed near a cave. Tyler's voice was faint but clear. "I think I see it over here." The video cut off. We stared at each other, and I saw the fear in Liz's eyes. "We need to go back to the RV and call for help," she said. "We can't leave him out here," I argued. "Hazel, look at his bag," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever did that?" Her words were cut off by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, the same one we'd heard the night before. It was close. Against my better judgment, I led us toward the cave. The growling grew louder as we approached, echoing off the canyon walls. Liz clutched a flashlight in one hand and a camping knife in the other. Inside the cave, the air was damp and smelled of decay. Animal bones littered the ground, some fresh, others ancient. And on the walls, strange symbols were etched into the rock. Spirals, claw marks, and what looked like human figures. Tyler, I called, my voice shaking. The growling stopped for a moment. There was silence. Then a voice echoed from the depths of the cave. Hazel, Liz, help me. It was Tyler. Liz bolted toward the sound, but I grabbed her arm. Wait, that's him! She cried. Listen, I whispered. It's coming from all directions. The growl returned louder this time. A shadow moved at the edge of our flashlight's beam, and then we saw it. The creature stepped into the light, and I froze. It was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal, with glowing red eyes and antler-like protrusions on its head. The Wendigo! Liz screamed, dropping her flashlight as the creature lunged toward us. I grabbed her hand and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing moved unnaturally fast, its limbs contorting as it chased us through the canyon. We burst out of the cave and sprinted back toward the RV. The Wendigo didn't stop. It clawed at the rocks, its guttural growls turning into distorted, mocking laughter. Keep going, I yelled, practically dragging Liz behind me. When we reached the RV, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The creature was right behind us, its shadow stretching long in the moonlight. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. The Wendigo clawed at the side of the RV, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Liz was sobbing, clutching her knife like it could actually help us. As we sped down the canyon road, the creature finally stopped. It stood in the middle of the road, watching us with those terrible glowing eyes. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the park. Liz cried the entire way, and I didn't blame her. Tyler was gone. We never found his body, and the park rangers chalked it up to a wild animal attack. But we knew the truth. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear his voice calling my name, and I know Liz does too. The Wendigo didn't just take Tyler. It left a piece of itself with us, a shadow that will never go away. My name is Julian Erickson, and I was 37 when this happened. It was late August 2021, and I had parked my RV in a remote section of Holly River State Park in West Virginia. I was there to film another episode for my YouTube channel, Trail Tales with Julian. You see, I'd quit my corporate job a year earlier and started traveling solo, documenting my adventures. The views paid for the gas, and the quiet helped me forget the life I'd left behind. That's what I told myself anyway. But what happened in Holly River, I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. I arrived just before noon. Holly River was breathtaking, with towering trees and streams that glimmered like silver veins in the sunlight. The air smelled clean and earthy, like a promise of peace. I pulled my RV into a spot deep in the park, far from the other campers. I wanted solitude for the footage, and honestly, for myself. The site was perfect, tucked against a hollow surrounded by a thicket of ancient oaks. The moment I stepped out, I felt the stillness, a quiet so deep it pressed against your eardrums. I brushed it off as the charm of being away from civilization. While scouting for shots, I found something strange, a pile of stones near the base of a tree, half covered in moss. Among them was an old scuffed shoe. It was tiny, like it belonged to a child, and the leather was cracked with age. It gave me a weird chill, but I pocketed it for the sake of storytelling. Every mystery needs an artifact, I joked into the camera. I set up my gear, filmed some establishing shots, and cooked a simple dinner. The first night was calm, even peaceful, until it wasn't. I woke up to laughter. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a high-pitched giggle, the kind of sound kids make when they're playing tag. But it didn't stop. It danced outside my RV, faint and teasing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, expecting to see campers or maybe a group of teenagers messing around. There was no one, just trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called. My voice echoed back at me. The laughter stopped and the silence rushed in like a weight. The forest didn't feel serene anymore. It felt like it was holding its breath. I shook it off and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near my RV. They were small, like those of a child, but there were no campsites nearby. The tracks led to the hollow and disappeared. I filmed them for my channel, cracking a nervous joke about ghost kids. The rest of the day felt off. My drone crashed during a flight, even though the conditions were perfect. My camera shut off mid-recording, and my backup batteries drained faster than they should have. And then there was this feeling like I was being watched. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but the forest was empty. I started editing footage that evening, hoping the work would calm me down. That's when I noticed it. In one of the clips, as I panned across the hollow, a shadow darted between the trees. It was small, childlike. My stomach dropped. I rewound and watched again. The shadow was there just for a second, but it was enough to make me lock my RV door before I went to bed. The second night was worse. It started with the laughter again, but this time it was closer, louder. I stayed inside, listening as it circled the RV. Then came the singing, a soft, eerie lullaby, just a few notes repeated over and over. I turned on every light I had, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The singing stopped, and I thought it was over until the knocking started. Tap, 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 on the windows, on the door, on the walls. Tiny hands testing, probing. I froze, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Go away," I shouted. My voice cracked, weak. The knocking stopped, and the silence returned. The next morning, I decided to leave. This was no ordinary park, no harmless ghost story. Something was wrong with this place, but my RV wouldn't start. The engine whined and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Swearing under my breath, I grabbed my backpack and started hiking to the main road. It was only a couple of miles, or so I thought. No matter which trail I took, I ended up back at the hollow. The trees seemed to shift around me, the paths looping in impossible ways. My GPS was useless. It kept blinking, searching for a signal. As the sun dipped lower, I heard it again, the laughter, the singing. It followed me, just out of sight, until I stumbled back to my campsite, exhausted and panicked. That night, I saw them, the children. They came as shadows at first, flickering at the edges of my vision. Then they stepped into the firelight. There were 3 of them, their faces pale and hollowed, their eyes dark voids that seemed to pull the light in. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, ragged dresses, suspenders. One of them pointed at me, and they started whispering. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then he appeared, the piper. He was tall, possibly too tall, with limbs that bent at strange angles. His face was shrouded in darkness, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and cruel. He raised one long, bony hand and beckoned. The children moved closer, their whispers turning into a song, sweet and haunting. I scrambled back, my hands fumbling for the flashlight, the camera, anything to protect myself. I don't know how I survived that night. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was sheer stupid luck. But I remembered the shoe, the artifact I'd taken. Desperate, I threw it into the fire. The flames roared higher and the children screamed, their voices twisting into something inhuman. The piper lunged toward me, his hand outstretched, but the fire seemed to hold him back. As the shoe burned, the shadows dissolved, and the forest fell silent. The piper was gone. When dawn broke, the RV started without a hitch. I drove away, not caring where I ended up, as long as it was far from Holly River. Later, when I reviewed my footage, I found something that chilled me to the bone. In one clip, as I filmed myself walking through the hollow, a figure loomed in the background. A tall, dark shape with unnaturally long limbs. The piper. I deleted the footage. Some things aren't meant to be shared. I don't camp alone anymore. Watched. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and tried to focus on transcribing my notes. But then the lights flickered, even though the generator was running fine. A faint hum filled the air, and my radio crackled to life, playing snippets of distorted voices. I turned it off, but the noise didn't stop. Outside, the motion detector light flickered on. My stomach clenched as I peeked out the window. The clearing was empty, or so it seemed. Just as I turned away, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, its shape almost human, but its arms were too long, and its head had the distinct curve of horns. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I didn't want to go outside, but something inside me, a mix of fear and defiance, made me step out. The figure was gone, but when I shone the flashlight on a nearby tree, I saw a fresh carving, a spiral, dripping with a black tar-like substance. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up clutching my knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the RV. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but before I could pack up, I felt an inexplicable pull to go back to the altar. It was as though something was compelling me, drawing me in against my better judgment. I grabbed the diary and my camera and headed back into the forest. When I reached the altar, the air was even colder than before. My breath came out in visible puffs and the chanting had returned, louder than ever. The spiral markings on the altar seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. Then I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating. I turned, and there it was, the horned figure, standing just beyond the clearing. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its frame. The horns curved like a ram's, and its hollow eyes glowed with a faint, dead, sickly light. It didn't move, but I felt its malice like a physical weight. It spoke, but not aloud. The words echoed in my mind, low and guttural. "You have trespassed. This place is mine. You will offer something of value, or you will not leave." I was paralyzed, my legs refusing to move. The diary slipped from my hands and landed on the altar. The horned figure tilted its head, as though amused. I don't know what gave me the idea. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe something in the diary had planted the seed. But I grabbed my lighter and set the pages on fire. The flames consumed the book quickly, and as they did, the chanting stopped. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like smoke. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to the RV, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, the RV shook violently, as though something was trying to force its way inside. The lights flickered, and the radio crackled with static. But I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away in the safety of a brightly lit gas station parking lot. It's been weeks since I left Devil's Hollow, but the memories still haunt me. The photos I took of the altar and the spiral symbols made their way into my article, sparking debates and wild theories online. But I didn't include everything. I didn't write about the horned figure or the whispers, or how I can still feel its presence even now. Sometimes late at night, I wake up to find the spiral symbol scratched into my walls, and I know it's not over. The hollow never lets you go. My name is David Dudley, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in late February, deep in the swamps of Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. I'd driven my RV into the wilderness looking for isolation and a chance to test my survival skills. I didn't go there for the peace or the beauty. I went to prove that I could live off the land, just me against nature. What I found instead wasn't nature. It was something darker, something I still can't fully explain. I arrived at Big Cypress early in the morning, the mist still clinging to the trees. My RV rattled over the rough dirt road, bouncing with every pothole. I finally found a clearing near the edge of the swamp, shaded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. It was perfect, remote, quiet, and miles away from the nearest person. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. My plan was simple: spend 2 weeks out here, relying on my skills and instincts. I had basic supplies, some canned food, a water filter, and a few tools, but I wanted to rely mostly on what I could catch or forage. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. By late afternoon, the swamp came alive. Birds called from the trees, frogs croaked in the distance, and the faint hum of insects filled the air. It felt like stepping into another world. But as I finished setting up camp, I noticed something odd: large hoofprints in the soft mud near my RV. They were too big to be from a deer and too deep to belong to a boar. I stared at them for a while, then shrugged it off. Big Cypress was home to all sorts of animals, and I figured it was nothing to worry about. That night, the swamp was eerily quiet. I sat by my campfire, jotting notes in my journal about the day. I was about to turn in when I heard it, a deep, resonant sound like the rumble of a distant drum. It came from somewhere in the swamp, low and rhythmic. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was just the wind or the creak of trees shifting in the breeze. I didn't want to admit it, but it left me uneasy. When I crawled into bed, I locked the RV door. I don't usually do that. There's nothing out here that I can't handle. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few days were more unsettling. On the second morning, I noticed that some of my supplies were missing. A few cans of food, a small hatchet, and my fishing line. I knew I hadn't misplaced them, and there was no sign of anyone else nearby. But the hoof prints were back, this time circling the RV. They were deeper now, like something heavy had been pacing around my camp. The swamp itself seemed different too. The birds that had been so noisy on the first day were silent, and the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I kept brushing off the feeling of being watched, but it was getting harder to ignore. On the fourth night, I heard the sound again, the drumming, louder this time and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the trees. I scanned the swamp, but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something tall and dark disappearing into the trees. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just the faint rustle of leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before retreating to the RV and locking the door again. The next day, I went deeper into the swamp, determined to find answers. I followed the hoof prints, which led me to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, half buried in the muck. It was adorned with animal bones, skulls, ribs, antlers, all arranged in a way that felt deliberate. The carvings on the altar were faded but intricate, depicting swirling shapes that seemed to shift if I stared too long. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't superstitious, but something about this place felt wrong. I backed away, intending to leave when I noticed fresh hoof prints leading away from the altar. They were impossibly large, almost like they'd been made by some kind of monstrous animal. That night the black stag appeared. It was just beyond the edge of the firelight, its glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. Its massive antlers seemed to stretch into the night sky, and its dark, sinewy body glistened as if wet. It didn't move, just stared, its presence heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there frozen. Eventually it turned and melted into the shadows without a sound. That night I dreamed of the black stag. In the dream, it stood at the edge of my campfire, speaking in a voice that was both deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder. "You've wandered too far," it said, its voice echoing in my head. "This is my domain. You can leave, or you can stay and be consumed." I woke, drenched in sweat. The fire had burned out, and the RV was colder than it had any right to be. When I stepped outside, I found hoof prints circling the camp again, closer this time, almost touching the edge of the fire pit. I decided I had to leave. I packed up what little I could, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery. It was completely drained, though it had been fully charged the day before. That night, the black stag returned. This time, it stepped into the light of the fire. It was even more terrifying up close, its fur matted and black, its eyes glowing like embers. It towered over me, and when it spoke, its voice echoed through the swamp. "You cannot leave without offering something in return." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Your freedom," it said. I didn't know what that meant, but I wasn't about to give it anything. Instead, I grabbed my lighter and ran to the altar. I doused it in fuel and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the bones and carvings. The black stag let out an unearthly roar, its form twisting and writhing before it dissolved into the shadows. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in days, the swamp felt alive again. The next morning, the RV started on the first try. I drove out of Big Cypress as fast as the dirt road would let me, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I haven't told anyone about what happened, not fully. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear the drumming sound, faint and distant. And when I close my eyes, I see those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness. My name is Joseph Livingston, and I was 18 when this happened in the summer of 2018. At the time, I thought the worst part of the trip would be being stuck in the middle of nowhere with my family and no Wi-Fi. Turns out I was wrong. So wrong. What happened in Bitterroot National Forest wasn't just weird, it was terrifying. It started with Dad's brilliant idea to take us camping. He wanted to reconnect as a family, which meant cramming me, my 7-year-old brother Ethan, and Mom into our RV and heading to the woods. Dad's name is Tom, by the way. He's a former Boy Scout who still believes duct tape and a multi-tool can fix anything. Mom, Sarah, was less enthusiastic about the trip, though she didn't say much. She had this way of pursing her lips when she was worried, and they were tight as piano strings. From the moment we left, we drove hours into the forest, farther than I thought was necessary. It was hot, sticky, and smelled like pine sap and mildew. Eventually, we found this clearing off some barely there dirt road. There were no other campers, no ranger station, just trees and silence. Dad clapped his hands. Perfect spot. I rolled my eyes. Perfectly creepy, you mean? Come on, Joseph, he said. It's an adventure. Ethan was already bouncing around, excited to explore. That's my little brother, quiet 1 second, full of energy the next. I helped unpack while Dad fiddled with the generator, which kept sputtering and dying. He muttered something about needing to tinker with it later. That first night I couldn't sleep, not because of the crickets or the distant rustling, but because of the weird, heavy feeling in the air. It pressed on me like a weight on my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation, right? But then Mom, who was always calm, woke up around midnight and just sat there, staring out the RV window like she was listening for something. The next day, Ethan found the doll. It was mid-morning, and we were setting up a fire pit when Ethan came running out of the woods, holding this small, handmade figure. It was a creepy thing, just a few twigs tied together with bits of fabric, but it had this unsettling human shape. "Look what I found," he said, smiling like he'd found treasure. "I'm going to call him Silas." Mom froze. "Where did you find that?" Ethan pointed to the edge of the forest by the big tree over there. Mom tried to take the doll from him, but Ethan clutched it tightly. "No, Silas is mine," he said. Dad laughed it off. "It's just a doll, Sarah. Let him have his fun." Mom didn't argue, but later, when she thought no one was looking, I saw her burying a similar doll she'd found near the fire pit. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, things got worse. It started with the noises, soft laughter, like kids playing, except it was coming from the woods, and it was way past dark. I thought maybe I was dreaming until I saw Mom sit bolt upright. She shook Dad awake. "Tom, listen," she whispered. Dad rubbed his eyes. "It's just animals." "Animals don't laugh," she shot back. I pressed my ear to the RV wall and heard it too. High-pitched giggles and rustling leaves, like someone or something was running just outside. Dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside despite Mom's protests. I peeked out the window as he swept the beam around. Nothing. "It's fine. Go back to sleep," he called. But it wasn't fine. The next morning, I noticed deep scratches on the RV's side, like claw marks. Dad brushed it off as a raccoon or something, but I wasn't convinced. Neither was Mom. That's when she started telling us about the stories her grandmother used to tell about spirits that lured children into the woods. "They mimic laughter," she said. "Voices. They trick you." Dad scoffed. "You're scaring the kids." But Mom wasn't trying to scare us. She was scared herself. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't seem bothered. He spent the day playing with Silas and humming a strange tune I'd never heard before. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged. "Silas taught it to me." I laughed nervously. Sure he did. By the third night, I was ready to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air was too still, too quiet, except for Ethan's humming. He'd been humming that same tune all day, and it was driving me nuts. "Ethan, can you stop?" I snapped. He didn't even look at me. "Silas says we're going to play hide and seek tonight." And that gave me chills. "Who's we?" I asked. "The other kids," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mom shot Dad a look. "We're leaving tomorrow." Dad sighed. "Sarah, it's just a phase. He's using his imagination." "Tom, something isn't right." That night, Ethan disappeared. We had just finished dinner when I realized he wasn't in the RV. I panicked, shouting his name as we searched the campsite. That's when we found the doll Silas, lying at the forest edge, smeared with sticky black sap. Mom picked it up, and her hands started trembling. "He's in the woods," she whispered. We grabbed flashlights and ventured in, calling Ethan's name. The trees closed in around us, the air thick with that oppressive heaviness. And then we heard it, the laughter, high-pitched giggles, just ahead. I ran toward it, but Mom yanked me back. "Stay together," she hissed. The laughter grew louder, and we saw them, a ring of pale children standing in a clearing. Their eyes were empty, like they weren't really looking at us. Ethan was standing in the center, holding hands with one of them. The child next to him was skeletal, its body twisted unnaturally, like it had been shaped from wood. "Ethan," Mom cried, stepping forward. The children turned to us in unison, their heads jerking unnaturally. My legs turned to jelly. Ethan didn't react. He just stood there, staring ahead, humming that eerie tune. "Let him go," Mom shouted. One of the children spoke, but its voice was hollow and wrong, like multiple voices layered together. "He belongs to the forest now." Dad aimed his flashlight at them, and for a moment, the light revealed their true forms, decayed, rotting bodies, their skin stretched thin over bones. The skeletal child smiled, its jaw unhinging wider than it should have. I wanted to run, but Mom grabbed my arm. "We're not leaving without him." She knelt, clutching the doll in her hands. "Take this," she whispered. "Take Silas back and let him go." The children didn't move, but their hollow eyes seemed to narrow. "Burn it," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. "Burn the doll." Mom hesitated, but Dad pulled out a lighter and set the doll ablaze. The children screamed, a piercing, otherworldly sound that echoed through the trees. Ethan collapsed, and the children dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a towering figure at the edge of the clearing, the Wendigo. It was skeletal, with antlers sprouting from its head and glowing, hollow eyes that burned into my soul. It let out a guttural growl and stepped toward us. Dad fired a flare gun, and the creature recoiled, its form flickering like smoke. We didn't wait. Grabbing Ethan, we ran back to the RV and didn't stop until we reached the nearest ranger station. We never saw the Wendigo again, but we didn't need to. It's still out there, waiting. Ethan doesn't talk about what happened. He says he doesn't remember. But sometimes I catch him humming that tune, and every time I feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, like it's still watching, because I know it is.